Hello, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate episode of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks project manager, and it has been an extraordinary ride being a part of season 6 with all of you. We've been in conversation with some fascinating writers who are telling stories that are more relevant and essential than ever. This week's guest is no exception. I'm honored to share that it is Myriam J. Chancy, author of What Storm, What Thunder from Tin House Books. Myriam will be interviewed by guest host Akilah White, a freelance book reviewer and editor whose work has appeared in The Book Slut, Rebel Woman Lit Magazine, The Jamaica Gleaner, and other venues. You can find Akilah's always trenchant and incisive commentary on Caribbean books and beyond in her online yard at If This Is Paradise on Instagram. I am certain that Akilah and Myriam are going to have a riveting conversation. As you all know, this season of Bios and Bookmarks has been devoted to the environment, to our Caribbean regional ecology, what we can learn from it, what relationships we currently possess with it, and how we can make those bonds stronger and better. We've called it At Home, the Green Remains, which is the title of a poem by the Jamaican educator John Figueroa. And as always, if you enjoy this episode and the work we do at the Bocas Lit Fest, please consider becoming a friend of Bocas Lit Fest. You'll see more information on joining friends at the end of the episode. Thank you all for being here. Stay tuned and enjoy.
Thank you very much for that fabulous introduction, Shivani. So as was said, my name is Akilah White, and I'm here to talk with a fantastic writer, Myriam J. Chancy. She is a Haitian Canadian-American writer who is a Guggenheim Fellow and Hartley Burr Alexander Chair of the Humanities at Scripps College in Claremont, California. She is the author of several award-winning novels, including Spirit of Haiti and The Loneliness of Angels, as well as pivotal academic works such as Framing Silence, revolutionary novels by Haitian women, and From Sugar to Revolution, Women's Visions of Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, which I'm currently reading with great pleasure. We are here to talk about her latest, What Storm, What Thunder, out from Tin House in the USA and HarperCollins in Canada. It's been released to rave reviews and has made several best of year lists, and we cannot wait to talk about it. So, in a time not long after yet another earthquake has hit Haiti earlier this year in 2021, What Storm, What Thunder arrives to us through the voices of 10 distinct characters through which Chancy has tried to capture what may seem the impossible, the life, the loss, and the disruption that was the earthquake in 2010. We're here to discuss how can a novelist uniquely capture, how can she map, remember, and challenge and even offer to heal through this memorable work. So I invite you, Myriam, to do the first reading.
Thank you so much, Akilah, for that introduction. And I also want to thank Shivani and Bocas for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So my first reading will be from two parts of From What Storm, What Thunder, from two distinct voices. The novel begins with a voice of Malu, who is a 75-year-old market woman, and she bookends the novel. She begins the novel and ends the novel. And you start with her voice in 2014, and then you will end with her voice actually in 2012. And then I'll also read from a character who is Trinidadian, but happens to be in Haiti during the earthquake, and his name is Leopold. So let me begin with Malu. And this is her recollection of the earthquake. Eventually, we, the market women, remembered our oil lamps and lit them one by one, those of us who could. Only part of a market had been crushed, the part against a wall. Still, it was impossible to tell what belonged to whom, and at that point, no one cared. We worked at freeing those we could, said prayers for the others, promising deliverance to those we could not get to give them some solace, some hope in their final moments, because salvation would soon be theirs. Then back down the street, darting back and forth, using the goods from the market to feed those working at rescue. Doing what we could as we always did, our large bodies moving through the rubble as if we were land whales, made for swimming through dust-laden air, made for parting human waves. We treated everyone alike. They had become all the same, were always the same. Something we had always known from our low to the ground perches, observing life like budgies, our heads wrapped in colorful scarves to keep the heat of the sun from roasting our brains, sweat slipping down our necks, draping the half moon of our chests exposed above the breasts. We fanned ourselves, but it didn't help. Shala! Heat came with the territory. But not this, not this, a different kind of heat. Sitting here under the hot sun all day, we ripen. The saints, the crooks, the foreigners, the white saviors, the bleeding hearts, they all need sustenance, and we give it to them. Close my eyes, look away. It's all the same. The need to shut everything down, slow my breathing, take in what's there to take in, let all the rest go. If only I could get rid of the images of the smells still clogging my nostrils. Ha! You would think that after so many years working in the market, nothing would offend this nose. Look what surrounds us every day. The mounds of smoldering garbage, the spoiling fruits with skins speckled with loitering flies, the leavings of dogs, the runoff of dirty water weaving its way through the alleyways, that dense, acrid stink of urine. Our marketplace is a world of colliding senses, not all of it pretty or fruitful, much of it decay, especially at the end of the day when the best of what's available is gone and all that remains are cast offs, the leftovers. This is the part of the day when those of us who work the market blend into the dust and the loam, become one with the elements, the odors of sweat and dung, the sweet sap of fleshy fruits ground underfoot, the nothing that we are, the all. We sweep up what's left of a day, knowing that striving toward perfection is beyond our reach. And so now I'll read from Leopold. And one of the things I tried to do with the novel and with the marketplace that, that I just illustrated was to give a sense of how people cross paths from all walks of life, whatever their social class, their social standing, their age, their gender. And so Leopold is one of those people that someone like Malu would cross. And he is a petty trafficker. So he has learned about chain of transmission between the islands, and so I'll just read from him, remembering as the earthquake is happening how he got to Haiti. He learned about the goings on in Haiti, where his mother had always maintained her maternal grandparents were from, and he remembered that they had been part of a group of elders who still spoke patois or creole like they did in Haiti, but many denied the connection. He learned that there was a bursting drug market in Haiti since the Americans had taken out Noriega. He nodded when he heard about the trade routes by water that could be used between northern Jamaica and southern Haiti, and from there by ground into the capital, which was protected by a smaller rocky island at the mouth of its bay. It suited him perfectly. He even liked the idea of a return to an ancestral land. He assured his new clients that he would be effective, deliver what they wanted, and some Panamanian rum to boot. They laughed at him. Don't you know those people claim they have the best rum in the world? He hadn't tasted Haitian rum yet, had never set foot in the mythical world he'd heard about only from his mother and her parents, and occasionally at carnival time, because it was the place that had ignited their dreams of liberty invoked during their camboulé, early versions of carnaval, when the slaves took to putting the cane to fire in search of a way out of violent exploitation and into freedom. That was how he made his way finally to the biggest catch of his life, to the land of the Bosal, the wild ones, the Africans who refused to be collared, who refused to thank the masters for their chains as if cuffs were bracelets. If he'd practiced thrift of necessity in the mountains of Paramin, where his mother's grandparents were from, in Haiti, he'd learned the true meaning of resourcefulness. Some things were the same as back home, the toys made for children out of bicycle parts, empty spools of thread, socks stuffed with torn clothing shaped into dolls. Some things he'd never seen before: old tires cut up and made into the soles of sandals, handbags made from candy and chewing gum wrappers, a girl's skipping rope used to guide a mule, a common gurney type chair contraption used to carry those whose legs were of no use to them or who had none, plastic colanders of different colors hung helter skelter on otherwise barren walls of living rooms and dens, taken down for use in the kitchen whenever needed, then scrubbed clean and placed back on the walls like totems or heirlooms, as if they weren't the common items for everyday use that they were. Fresh, deep green banana leaf used to keep a plastic jug of water steady on a girl child's head. Nothing wasted. Despite this ingenuity, there were still signs of grinding poverty: the barefoot, the infants wearing torn, dirty t shirts without underclothes, wandering through the streets, seemingly unconscious of their nakedness. He thought of his own children, of how, despite never taking care of the boys, he had never considered that he might need to worry about their being clothed or bare, never worried that they might be snatched off the street or mistreated. It made him think of Mathilde, who looked at him with an undoing innocence, a trust that he had done nothing to earn. Even if the unthinkable did happen where he was from, such things were invisible or unclear. There were no obvious signs of vulnerability. Later, he was to learn that even the children of the wealthiest could be at risk through kidnappings for ransom. Knowing about the precariousness of each member of his society, the uneasy seesaw on which everyone existed, endeared the place to him. It became a second home in which he came to be unquestioned. He could come and go as he pleased. He could remake himself.
Thank you so much for that reading, Miriam. So, what I first wanted to talk about was how I found your novel to be such a vital energy force in realizing a more fuller and truer idea of Haiti in my psyche. Because, I mean, in those scenes, perhaps persons would find it counterintuitive to see the novel as a healing reading
Mm,
experience, but it was for me.
mm,
Reading other words from other Dominican and Haitian writers this year, whether on Twitter or in academic works, to your novel, I've sort of realized how so much of those of us who either have very stereotypical ideas of Haiti and its people, or even those who reject like the more negative
mm,
tropes and are very very much in touch with how important Haiti has been, not just to the Americas, but to the world, I still find that when we talk about Haiti and its people, it's in these sort of fixed notions along this straight timeline. It's very much
Right.
sort of, it's the revolution, and then it's the
Hmm.
occupation, and then it's,
Right.
and so what I found in reading your book and other writers is that it gave me more of this sense of the in-between Haiti, as I
Mm.
call it, that went beyond the binaries and showed a kind of flow and interdimensionality that I genuinely found healing and really challenged even concepts that I didn't know I had, having been
Interesting.
exposed, having been
Mhm.
exposed to all kinds of sort of corporate media, and you think that you're countering it in your head, and then you realize that actually there are still issues that you have to work through. And I
Mhm.
connected that to photos that Nadia Huggins, who is a photographer and artist from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who is in Haiti right now, I think, and is
Mm.
taking pictures and sharing them on her Instagram. And I saw these green hills. I think she's in
Mhm.
Jacmel. And there was a part of me that was startled. I was like, oh, because I've heard so much about the deforestation in Haiti,
Mhm.
the aridity. So it sort of creates this sort of idea in your mind of a completely sort of
Barren or desert. Mhm.
exactly. And then you
Mhm.
see that and you go, but wait, and that was like the moment where I really started to reflect. And so I just wanted you to talk about how you see your novel really helping in such an important counter narrative.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that was one of the overriding objectives in writing the novel because it took me years to get to the point of wanting to write the novel or thinking I should write the novel. But when I did, I know that part of my objective was to dispel these kinds of, easy notions of what people think Haiti stands for, whether that's positive or negative. So lauding Haiti for the revolution, but then misunderstanding its poverty or not knowing the history behind its poverty, and then having those two polarities, as you say, these two binaries sort of overshadow any understanding of Haitians as a people, like people in other places. And this is why I decided to have a multivocal narrative, 10 voices as opposed to one person telling you the story of the earthquake, because I really wanted people to get a very human feel that is holistic so that you get a sense of the wide variety of points of views, and also how lives were truly disrupted, and how that was felt not just on a national level, but on a very individual, on a family level, but also on a very, person to person level. And so, even what I just read from Leopold here, where Leopold discovers that there are these similarities between Trinidad and Haiti, and he knows he has a distant connection to Haiti, but it's not until he goes there and he sees the market and he sees how people, reinvent things, that he realizes there's a connection. But then he also learns more about the day to day, especially of very poor people. And so throughout the novel, you find these lists, whether it's his litany of reinvention, or in the camps where another character like a 15-year-old Tafia will tell about the day to day in the camp, and then another character who's in the camp, Olivier, who's in his 30s and has moved from one camp to another, also talks about what camp life is like. And so I wanted to try to give an insider look into Haiti. And I've been grateful that Haitian readers who know that I live outside of Haiti actually have been
Mhm.
surprised at the accuracy, of the telling, but also find themselves in it. And readers like yourself from the Caribbean, realizing that there's something there that feels a lot like home, even if it's not home.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Getting to that point of feels like home, the market scenes, so many characters in remembering the market. One who was going through it and was saying that despite, the stench and the garbage and the flies that they love, I think it's Sonia, she loves going to the market. And I have
Mhm.
the exact same experience, right?
Mhm.
Going downtown Kingston, here I am where I'm in Jamaica,
Right.
which is
Uh-huh.
a place where some people have very mixed feelings about, even though it's so much the center of our food. I mean, both
Mhm.
local and important, and is a very
Right.
sort of important network to
Mhm.
small farmers coming from a family where my grandfather was a small farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of find, I guess, the so-called Tapanaris, upper class persons, will send their domestic staff to
Right.
go down early, right? Like they'll
Right.
go down
That's right.
early and send it before us. And I wanted to talk about how the market and the relationship that people have to food through the
Mm-hmm.
market and the agriculture
Right.
and the landscape is sort of contrasted to other characters like Richard, for
Mm-hmm.
example,
Right.
with this sort of very distant, very sort of capitalist,
Mm-hmm.
possessive, dominant relationship in terms of he works in
He's a water
privatization.
CEO.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and he
Mm-hmm.
sells water to people who already have water, and then Leopold,
Mm-hmm.
who sort of starts out having something of like a similar relationship in
Mm-hmm.
tandem with the turtles, but you see how both of them sort of end up somewhere different. So if you could talk
Yeah,
about
I think they kind of span a range. So you have the characters like Malou, who are the marketplace is
yes.
a, sort of a second home, who I
Mhm.
read from earlier, and who, knows everything about the society, all levels of the society. And this is why I wanted her to bookend the novel, because these are the women that are often photographed but seldom interviewed, seldom thought of as having a lot of knowledge about the culture, and they know everything about it. And in order to survive, they also understand global economics. And the connection between, I think I didn't make the connection between Leopold and Malou apparent, because I read a little bit after this section. But the reason Leopold knows about the trafficking routes is because the trafficking routes are actually the merchant routes.
Richard Rouse, right?
Yeah, which I learned from market women, talking to market women in Jamaica, actually, in
Oh,
northern Jamaica,
okay.
explaining to me where because I had once met a market woman in Jamaica who had
Mhm.
Haitian crafts, and she explained
Oh,
to me that she took a boat, and would go to southern
wow.
Haiti and
Yeah.
trade items. And so so this is something I lent to Leopold, but he knows about these routes. And then,
Mhm.
of course, these are routes people would use.
Mhm.
But Leopold and Richard are interesting poles, right? Because
Right.
Richard is the son of a market woman, and he doesn't acknowledge that all of his knowledge about markets and economics comes from his
From
mother.
her.
He
Mhm.
just wants to become well known and detach himself from Haiti, make it, in the outside world, which he does. He goes to France, he becomes a CEO, he marries a French woman, has children, and doesn't really dream of coming back. But he has left behind a natural daughter, whom we'll come to know, Anne, who's an adult by the time we read the novel. And then, comes back with a lot of nostalgia about Haiti, which he is surprised by.
Mhm.
So that when he's laying around, in the pool of this very wealthy enclave, he's thinking about all the good things he could eat. So their connection is still
Mhm.
food,
There. Yes.
as food staples. And then on the other hand, you have Leopold, who's come from very little, but he's making a lot of money trafficking. He's at the same hotel, and then through his experience of the earthquake, has a kind of reckoning with his history. So you mentioned the turtles,
Yes.
where he has gone from being, a Boy Scout, learning about preserving the environment, preserving the sea turtles, and then has learned so much about them that when he's trapped in that lift in the hotel after the earthquake, he wishes he was a sea turtle
Yes.
because of their mechanisms of survival, right, in the
Mhm.
ocean. But he grew up to be someone who would steal the eggs, which I know is a big problem in Trinidad, because they're considered a delicacy, which is again a foodstuff, but it's a black market foodstuff.
Mhm.
So in a way, what the novel does, and actually you brought it to mind in a way that I haven't thought of before, there's a lot of interweaving of
Yes.
these kinds of goods.
Mhm.
I was thinking more consciously of water, who
Oh,
has
okay.
water, who doesn't
Mhm.
have
Doesn't.
water, who replaces water with alcohol in order to survive, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Potable water, who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it. But you're absolutely right that food is integral to the novel as well.
Yeah.
And the things that bind you to a land, the natural produce and the things we make of it.
Yes. 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 Absolutely. I couldn't stop thinking about it just because of my grandfather and the farmer and the way he
Mhm.
talked about, his relationship with the market woman and the negotiation of prices and
That's right.
how external factors, affect the local and all.
This is
And
so important.
yeah, it's very, very important. And I think persons might not be as aware of how all of these
Yeah,
things come into bear, and how international other governments and international agencies that we see in our spaces, I think face forwarding is, charitable organizations who are
that's
helping
right.
us out, but actually they come in with a lot of sort of policy demands that
Hmm.
also shape our local food distribution in ways that,
Well, and
yeah,
there's a
go ahead.
connection to Olivier's chapter,
Yes.
where Olivier is, he's an accountant.
Hmm.
He's lost two of his children in the earthquake, and a third is injured, gravely injured. And he's the one who moves to another IDP camp because there's been a promise of work. And basically, they're going to build a factory outside of Haiti, outside of Port-au-Prince. And the idea then, and this is true to life, they're going to decentralize Haitians out of Port-au-Prince, which was built for 250,000 people, but in 2010 had over 3 million people. And
Hmm.
by promising people work, they could get people to move. So about 5,000 people left a very large camp in central Port-au-Prince to this camp that was basically in a desert area with no running water, no electricity. And
Mm.
this is where he finds himself. And I renamed that camp Camp Bocas, but people can research what the actual camp was. But
Mhm.
as he's there, he partly out of grief, he's ruminating on the numbers, ruminating on aid, ruminating on the millions of dollars which within a few months were already pouring into Haiti, and not going to the people who were the most affected by the earthquake. And one of the things he talks about is also the flooding of of Haiti with things that they don't really need, that are not helpful. And this also recurs in some of the chapters with other earthquake survivors who are in the camps, like Tafia, who I mentioned before, the 15-year-old, who see
Mhm.
all this rice coming in. And what happened immediately after the earthquake is that local producers said, we have enough to feed our own people. Please
Mhm.
do not send these huge bags of white rice, which is less nutritious than the local rice, actually. Do not
Mhm.
send in all of these foodstuffs from the outside. Let us feed our own. And they were not listened to, and so that crushed the local markets, even though the produce was available. And I remember going into Haiti in 2011 and beyond, and finding that the local produce, was very, very expensive. Because what
Mhm.
happened is that bringing in all of that free food meant that the prices of the local prices were driven up. So even people who were working class, middle class, found themselves, instead of buying, 5 carrots for a family of five, maybe buying one and giving, everyone a
Mhm.
little piece. And so it really, but this is a practice that has gone on since prior to the earthquake, for years, for decades, actually, going back to one of the Clinton administrations. The tariffs were affected so that it was cheaper for the Haitian government to allow Arkansas rice to come in than
Mhm.
to actually put tariffs on them, because they were disallowed to do so,
Right.
and to make sure that the local rice farmers could keep up with local demand and sell at a reasonable rate. So these things are all interconnected. What we eat, where it comes from, the cost of having things come from the outside,
Mhm.
and how the local economies are actually prevented from thriving.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, all of that is brought up in the novel. So I hope, audience, if you haven't had it yet, make plans to get it. It's holiday season. It's perfect time. So I want to go back to that moment that you mentioned with Leopold in the elevator, and
Mhm.
he imagines himself as a turtle.
Yeah.
And I noticed a continuing thread of the relationship between peoples and animals.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
whether real, I mean, I guess in a realist sense or otherworldly,
Mhm.
and this kind of sort of transformative link. So you have Leopold there in a way thinking about how to survive,
That's
really,
right.
and sourcing that from a turtle, which might seem like a counterintuitive thing that we, for a sort of human-centric way that we tend to think, about ourselves and about survival. And I was very intrigued by that. And then I was intrigued by all of the dogs in the novel that appear in different ways, like different relationships that characters have with dogs, whether in Haiti or you have like with Didier in Boston, but then also more transformative, I guess, animal forms like the werewolves, like that came up a lot as well, and Sukyan. And I wanted you to talk about that a bit more. If you could mention, like, was it deliberate? Was it a conscious thing to do? And what was the purpose there? I found it like really fascinating on a first read.
Yeah, so definitely intentional.
Yeah.
Something not everything is intentional or conscious,
Yeah.
but definitely intentional. And one of the things, so in Haitian art, if you've ever seen traditional Haitian painting, you'll see a lot of animals. You'll
Okay.
see. So there's a saying which is an ironic saying, which is there are no giraffes in Haiti, but actually there are. So if you look at the paintings, you'll see giraffes, you'll see panthers, you'll see cougar, all these kinds of things. And the idea behind that, when you would ask painters, why are there, these giraffes in your painting, they would say, because Africa is here. So that there was this sort of sense of a direct link to the natural world, the world that had been left behind, but still animated this world. And so this relationship to nature is really important, but a nature that is also mystical and spiritual. So you might not be able to see, these animals, but they're still here with us, right? They transcend time. They transcend the separation with the Atlantic. They're always here, which also means that their spirits are here, and what they stand for is with us. Some of it, very healing, and other parts of it, perhaps, more disturbing, which is where you get the figure of the werewolf, for
Right.
example, or of the Sukuyan. Although the Sukuyan has different, people think of her, and I know she exists in other parts of the Caribbean, as
Yeah.
both positive and as negative, right?
Yeah.
Because she's
Yes.
the old lady who is able to take off her clothes at night and roam, take off her skin and
Skin.
roam
Yes.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But that can also be seen as a positive, because on a social level, that means she's getting rid of all of the social, all the ways in which women are limited in the Caribbean, and she's able to do what she likes under the cover of night. But then to get back to the dogs and also the turtle, I have spent some time in Trinidad, and I didn't see the turtles hatch, but I heard a lot about them, and I remember being so struck by the preservation, efforts being done there. And so when I created Leopold, I just knew I had to have a turtles there. And then when I did the research on how turtles survive, I thought, to me, this sounds like Leopold, because once with each character, the character kind of informs you as to where they will end up. And sometimes it's a surprise. So, for example, I was surprised with the way Richard's life, where his life, how I don't want to give it away for people who haven't read the novel, but his encounter with a larger force, a larger water force, was essential, right? Which is a real confrontation with the natural world, which he is trying to control. But then with Leopold survives, and that gives it away for readers, but he survives. But part of his rumination is how to be a different person than he has been. If he survives, that's what he's thinking about. If I survive this, what can I be? What could I be? And that's when the sea turtles come back to him. So in a sense, that is a kind of a spiritual awakening, that he could preserve the natural world, but he could also emulate it. And then with the dogs, going to Didier's chapter, and Didier's in Boston, a musician who thought that if he would leave Haiti, he could take, America by storm, and that's not the case. He ends up, driving a cab, and it's not even his cab; it's whatever friends of his allow him to drive when they're not driving, and he's noticing class difference in America, and he's learning about American-based racism, which is different from colorism or class difference in the Caribbean. and he's really shocked by the way he's treated because of the color of his skin. But he's also shocked by the kind of sort of neoliberal discourse where people have a discourse around preserving animals, but don't treat people very well.
Yeah.
And so he has a kind of rumination on, what does that mean? What does it tell you when a people treat their dogs better than they treat people? And then he starts thinking, well, if I had a dog, I would do this or I would do that. And then he goes through his own troubles, and throughout his chapter, you have him thinking about religion and spirituality. He finds an old copy of the King James Bible in one of the cabs, so he's reading, about what could happen, if there's a cataclysm, not knowing that he's going to, from afar, witness one. And it makes him think about the nature of God. What is a God? And of course, I do, a play that other authors have done too, reversing the letters of God into God.
Dog.
And
Right. Yeah.
then, and then that changes the order of the sort of man-centric, human-centric
Exactly.
specious notion, and thinking, well, what would happen if we thought of a universal force which was natural? How
Yeah.
would it shift our relationship to one another and our relationship to the natural world, including animals?
Yeah. Picking up on that point, I've completely strayed
It's
from
okay.
the script, but talking about that sort of neoliberalism and who as life or what as life is valued, with Richard again, because he may not be my favorite character, but I'm so fascinated. But I don't really have a favorite character. I know, well,
No, some people do, so that's
I
good. That's
don't.
interesting.
I
I
I
like
don't
that.
really. I mean, there are some that perhaps make me more emotional than others, but I was
Right.
actually equally intrigued by
Mhm.
everyone. And I think the only person that I sort of balked when I saw that they had a chapter was Jonas, and I won't say why, but
Okay.
I was when
Balked in
I
a
saw.
good way, or
Oh no, as in it's a good way, but
ah,
I was so I guess afraid to hear what he had to say because
mhm.
it's not going to be the happiest chapter readers.
Yes.
I'll give that, very poignant,
Yeah.
very emotional, and so I was like, oh wow, Chancy's going to take us through it as everyone as everyone has been saying, and we've all loved it. So
Good.
please sign up for the experience. But yes, with Richard, I noticed I kind of have my head canon about him and the
Mm,
reason why he sort of grew up the way he did in such a distinctly different way,
mhm.
from his mother. And you do have a lot of characters say lines about how it's hard for a boy to grow up without a father. But
Mhm.
in terms of sort of his relationship with sort of commodifying the environment, I remember he said when he was in France, and he
Mhm.
was talking about how multiculturalness is in vogue, and
Mhm.
the way how basically he was talking about how they commodified blackness and sort of
Right.
made it into like an accoutrement, like that you could sort of possess. And you
Mhm.
also see him relate to the world as and other persons, as
Right.
something to possess. And I wondered if it was because he sort of noticed, this is my headcanon, this is
Mm.
what I think about him. He sort of noticed that that kind of commodification of life and surroundings and really saw it from this different perspective than what
Mm.
his mother was bringing to him. So I wondered if you
Mm.
could talk about that
Yeah.
kind of link, the way how he commodifies his environment and other persons, and how he also recognizes that he himself and his blackness especially is a commodity. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, that's a good point to think through. I'm not quite sure. I mean,
Yeah.
what's interesting about Richard is that he is. There are critiques embedded in his own storytelling of his own
True.
behavior,
Yes.
and so he knows there's something wrong with it,
He won't
even
change.
though. Um, I don't know, because I
I
think
don't know. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
there's a moment near the end of his, when he tells
Oh
his story, where
yes.
he remembers his mother in an
Yes.
unexpected
In this
way,
way, yes, that's true.
and
And
he
then
has a feeling like he
he
realizes there's
could.
something that he missed, whether it
Yes.
was and oh, I really don't want to give it away,
I
but
know, that's why I'm trying to avoid saying anything I don't
I'll just
either.
say this:
It's
there's
good
something
though.
interesting about Richard in that he did have a father until his teen years, right? So,
Right, right,
and from what Malou says about her husband, who passed away, is that
right.
he was an exceptional man, right?
Yeah,
That
true.
she, which is why she allows people to call her by his
By
name,
his name,
because she
right.
was constantly talking about him as a young person. So this has
Mm-hmm.
stuck, because Lou is not her name. Her name is actually Anne,
Yeah.
and Richard's daughter is named after her.
Mm-hmm.
But she lets people call her Malou because she just wants to keep his memory alive. So he
Mm-hmm.
did have this, and but then she moved him
To the
into
boarding
a
school.
boarding school,
That's what I thought. Right,
and
right.
that's what changed his path.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, on the
Mm-hmm.
one hand, she is happy for that because she wanted him to have a better life. On the other
Right.
hand, he saw another world, and he chose to
That
cut
one.
off his mother
Mm-hmm.
because he wasn't taught from that moment on to valorize what she stood for.
Mm-hmm.
He was basically channeled into everything French is good, higher learning, become wealthy, and he didn't
Right.
make any of the connections that he's now beginning to make in
Make
the
I think.
return. But also
Right.
because he's lost everything, and you're right, he was commodifying himself in
Mm-hmm.
order to
Yes.
become upwardly mobile, because
Right.
this is, the connection with his wife, and he was
Right.
commodifying his wife
Yes.
because she provided the path to upward mobility. So they
Mm-hmm.
have a transactional marriage, you know,
Yes. Very
a
much so.
transactional marriage which he loses because of everything he's suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And in that return to Haiti, which is he's called back by his grown daughter, he starts putting the pieces together. And I think, to me, it's fascinating that he tells us the conversations he overhears in the hotel, and there's an implicit critique in his doing that. You know.
Yes, yes, that group at the table. Yes. So, well, I'll invite you now to do the second reading.
Yes, and so I think I'm going to read from Sonia,
Yes.
who is the older sister of Tafia, the 15-year-old that we've mentioned here in conversation. And let me see. I actually want to. So I wanted to read just because of what we've just talked about. Let me see here. Well, maybe we'll come back to it, but I'm going to read from a section. This is on page 44 to 45 of a novel. And Sonia is an interesting character because she's a beautiful, striking woman who has found out that her father, the father she grew up with, is not her father, and understands that because she comes from a lower socioeconomic background, that she will be preyed upon because of her looks. And so she has decided that she will free herself from being predated upon by becoming a sex worker, and in the large hotels. And she makes a deal with her best friend Dieudonné that she meets in a club, that the two of them will hustle together. And I'm going to read from a section that reveals how they think of their identity and what they do. Dancing led to talk, intensive conversation, seeing oneself in the other's soul. Dieudonné told me about himself, his single mother, and how she had lost everything, even a piece of her mind, when his father left them, and still they saw him walking about town, the relief at knowing that he had not died or disappeared, the pain at knowing that he could smile and laugh away from them and had created another life with another woman, other children, for there were many. His mother had died prematurely, old at a young age, but happy in a way, because she knew that her brother, even if he was Massissi, would take care of her son in Jérémie, and because losing peace of mind had led to losing that peace of mind that made her more aware of her pain. He told me about his job as a fixer, how he could get anything for anyone: car service, drugs, fighting cocks, favors, intimate and not so intimate, anything. I told him about how I had traded on my looks since the time I discovered that my father was not my father, but I had a half sister by another father, and that I wanted one day to be a mistress rather than a maid, to have a rich man's wealth, but not his ring on my finger, none of his children. We came to an agreement right there and then. He would look out for me, be my go between, make sure I didn't have to do anything I didn't consent to do. Then eventually, if everything went right, we could get each other out of a game. He dreamed of a house far away from the road and high in the hills above the capital in Keskov, a house like the rich men owned where they kept mistresses or vacationed with their families. He wanted a house like that, no mistress, no children, for himself, and chosen family. He described it in such detail that I could see it in my mind's eye, could see myself there. As I thought myself into his dream, felt myself inside of his life, his speech stopped, and I found myself floating there within, as if in a painting. He continued, "You understand, don't you, that I'm M?" He had not needed to say it. If you were a hustler, you were always, in some way, M, queer, even if you didn't know what that meant, had never touched someone of your own sex with desire or love. I nodded, told him about the other women I worked with, how we depended on one another for everything. I didn't explain the fact that there was a choice in this for me, but I actively chose the women with whom I shared intimacies. I suppose I was deceitful because I didn't want to break the spell of our meeting, but I was careful to let him know as we entered into our contract that he needn't bother brokering paid services for me with women, especially with foreign women. This was my private business. He could think of it what he wanted. I knew that women could be as brutal, as callous, as deceitful, but I still needed an arena of hope, and so I chose women, my women, and they in turn, and for the same reasons, chose me.
Time for one more quick question. I wanted
Sure.
you to talk about this chapter and Sonia and Dee in particular because I loved them so much as
Mhm.
this chosen queer family. I was surprised to see them because I hadn't really heard anyone bring them up in terms of interviews with you prior or on posts. And I thought, why
Mhm.
isn't everyone screaming about them? I have yet, I mean, of course, it's probably why make a big fuss? They're just like anyone else. But I have yet to reach a stage where I can be blasé about finding queer Caribbean characters in Caribbean fiction. So I
Mhm.
just would love for you to sort of speak to why you felt it was important to have them in the novel and why you wrote about them the way you did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at my work across my academic work into the novels, I've always felt that it's really important to include queer voices in the scholarship as well as the creative writing,
Mhm,
and I think with Haiti, it's even more complex in a certain kind of way because the ways in which queer people identify ourselves within Haiti or even beyond Haiti, especially related to Vodou and
mhm,
spiritual traditions, is not the same as other parts of the Caribbean, I
mhm.
believe, or
I'd
especially in
agree.
terms of North
Yeah.
America. And
Mhm,
so, you'll seldom find terminology, what we, North American LGBTQ terminology doesn't really exist in Haiti unless you have been on the outside and come back in. And so I wanted in this novel because in 2010, which also happened in the late 1800s when there was an earthquake in Cap Haitien,
mhm,
lesbians in particular, so women who love other women, were blamed for both of those earthquakes. And I
mhm,
wanted to counter that discourse, which is within Haiti discourse, to show how some queer individuals within Haiti might have been affected by the earthquake, and how they, like others, would have extended family, friends, lovers, and also be working towards rebuilding. Which is why in
mhm,
Sonia's chapter she talks about the fear of returning to her area of town, which is Bel Air, and not being greeted,
mhm,
warmly, because not only is she's also a sex worker, which is, looked down upon,
mhm,
and she doesn't return often, and so she's afraid, but at the same time says, well, at this point, who could care, what I am or who we are, because
mhm,
the saviors will look like who they will look like. And so I wanted to include their narratives, to be inclusive, but also to move away from this idea of blame. And my conjecture, with those discourses after both of those earthquakes, which didn't recur this summer, so I'm thankful for that, the
Right.
earthquake that just happened in August 2021, has to do with the collapse in the mainstream conversation around both sexuality and gender identity of strong femalehood, strong women with, moving out of heteronormativity. So if a woman chooses not to marry, chooses not to have children, regardless of whether she has same-sex relationships or not, she is often put down by saying, "Oh, well, she's a lesbian," But the issue really is that these women are seen as very powerful for having refused marriage, having refused children, and if they are having same-sex relationships, for having the audacity to desire elsewhere. And so this is also why at the end of the novel, Sonia has an integral part in a healing that takes place among the women, because I also wanted to connect that, the freedom of choice around sexuality to Vodou, which is a spirituality which is, some people think of as queer, but I think more as being without gender, being, which then creates an inclusivity for queer space, but has to do with transcending our very materially based notions
Right.
of gender. And so this is why, you have this, Sonia is very central, and why I wanted to give Sonia and Dieudonné a space in the novel, to navigate this lack of inclusion, and to give Vodou spirituality a very strong place, because outside of Haiti, non-Haitians blamed Haitians' beliefs in Vodou, on for why the earthquake happened, as if not being Christian would somehow bring to you a natural disaster, which is an impossibility. And this is why the novel opens with an incantation to Legba, and then Malou's chapter begins with an incantation to Erzuli. And so from the very moment when a reader opens the novel, they ritualistically become part
Yes.
of Vodou and this altar space. And that's
Yeah.
why I hope that when people stumble onto Sonia, they realize that of course there would be a Sonia, and of course there would
Of
be a
course.
Dieudonné, because you're
Yeah.
now in a Vodou space.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. We have a comment from an audience member, Christine Cardosa. She says, "Thank you for this important space. Moving towards living from our masculine and feminine energy versus gender." Yes.
Which brings us back to our conversation about the connection to the natural world and the
World.
natural order, because
Yeah.
we shouldn't be imposing genders on other species either, right? So there's
Exactly.
so much there.
So much there. So now we're going to go into our final fun segment, which is called Promptly Written. This is where we give a scenario to the writer, in this case, Chancy. And the scenario is you step onto an elevator where the publisher and editor of your dreams are in conversation about a very specific topic. It's up to you to pitch them your dream project for that topic, because they're talking about something that you'd like to pitch to. And it can be anything, be it a book, play, sculpture, musical album, anything creative your heart desires. And the prompt for this one is God's pencil has no eraser. And you can say the Creole if you like, of
Crayon
course.
bon Dieu pas gain gomme. Crayon bon Dieu pas gain gomme. God's pencil
Yes.
has no eraser.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big challenge, but I've come up with a response for this,
Yeah.
because as we were preparing for today's conversation, I just
Mm-hmm.
looked across my study. I'm in my study at home here, and my eyes fell on a couple of pieces that I got
Oh,
from an artist in Jacmel.
okay.
And you were talking at the beginning about your
I
friend who's
was, yes,
photographing in Jacmel. So this is by an
yes.
artist named Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
So these are two pieces that I got.
Oh,
And these are two pieces that are actually fragments of fallen buildings from the earthquake
Okay. Yes.
that he treated and painted with Vodou images, so
Mm-hmm.
the serpent and actually the marassa,
Mm-hmm.
cult of twins.
Yeah.
And so when I think of this crayon bon Dieu pagan gomme, God's pencil has no eraser,
Mm-hmm.
artists in Haiti have, taken things like fragments from the earthquake, but you can't change, you can't undo what the earthquake did, but you can make something new of it.
Yes.
So my special project, and I'll show a little piece. So this is something I made, and I talked about this in another
Yes.
live,
You do
which is that
ceramics.
which I'm a ceramicist,
Yes.
and the thing about ceramics is that you take things from the earth
Mm-hmm.
and you create something new of it. But the thing about ceramics is that once you glaze it, it cannot be erased, so it does not
Ah.
degrade. But
Mm-hmm.
before you get it to this point, when you're throwing on the wheel, or if you're hand building, you can always throw it back in the bucket and start over again. So I would say that my special project would be to incite that publisher and that editor to
Mm-hmm.
create a ceramics atelier, yard, à
Oh,
la
yes.
cour,
Yes,
in
yes, yes.
Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and maybe with satellite places in the Southern Peninsula, where
Mm-hmm.
young people or women with children, or anybody who needs an artistic outlet.
Yeah.
And there are ceramicists in Haiti, some of them using the Taino traditional ways of using the red
Oh.
earth, and
Mm-hmm.
others who've been trained outside, and who do things like this. This is made out of porcelain.
Mm-hmm.
But the great thing is we also have a mural tradition in Haiti.
Yes.
So if you fired something and you weren't going to keep it, you can smash it and you can make murals. And Jacmel is
Ah.
well known for its murals around the sea walls. So that's what I would do. I would incite them to create public yard spaces for
Mm-hmm.
ceramics, both hand building and throwing, because God's eraser, God's pencil has no
No
eraser,
eraser.
but you can always make something new that is beautiful from the earth. So that was it. That's my pitch.
Hello? Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Sorry,
Yeah.
there was a bit of a glitch, but I
Ah,
did get most of it. I did get most of
okay.
it. And it
Good.
sounds fantastic. And actually, a connection to the novel, because there
Mm,
is a scene, I think, in Anne's chapter, who's
mm.
an architect, and she sees the church, the Holy Trinity Cathedral,
That's
right,
right.
with the
That's
mural.
right.
And you
Yes.
actually question it because, of course, I think, or was it that a Smithsonian person came here and said that it can't be preserved? But you wrote about how there were pieces that were gone, and you were thinking, is it to be sold, or is it that these persons are going to take it and sort of transform
That's
it like
right.
it's something to keep, from this experience, and use it, in a way that feels more regenerative to them.
Can
So yeah.
Do I have a moment to read that paragraph? I know we
Um,
didn't plan it.
I just read the paragraph. Yes, absolutely. I think we have time, and then we'll just wrap up.
Yeah, this is on page 281, and
Mm-hmm.
this is Anne, and she says the extent of the damage was massive beyond anything one could try to imagine. I came across an article on the destroyed murals of Holy Trinity Cathedral, a church that had been built by an African American led congregation in the days when it was rarer to have a non Catholic English speaking church. It had beautiful murals decorating its walls, murals I had seen only once on a school trip. The murals had been painted in egg tempera by Haitian artists with names like Aubin and Dufault. These artists had painted biblical scenes translated into a Haitian reality. Judas the traitor was no darker than all the saints, and the disciples were brown of skin. The Virgin Mary was Erzuli, also known as Ezili, attended by dark angels, scars upon her cheek. Jesus carried the Haitian flag as if it were heaven's flag. Christ's baptism took place under a waterfall, our own seau d'eau, where the Vodou spirits live, bless, and heal. Among the masses, the Savior was shown to be anointed by the ancestors alongside the lowly, stripped to their underthings, the trees surrounding them girded for the gods, prayers made and unmade in the name of the living through the intercessors, the undead, the teeming nature all around, both things that cannot be seen or explained.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that reading. And with that, we've come to the end of our penultimate episode in the Bias and Bookmarks interview series as part of NGC Bocas Lit Fest program, 10 years strong. Thank you so much to Myriam.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it was a fantastic time. Thank you so much to Shivani and the team for inviting me. Thank you so much, audience, for being a great listeners and participants. And we will see you next time. Be sure to get What Storm, What Thunder at your favorite bookseller. You will not regret it. It is one of my best reads for the year, without
Thank you
question.
so much, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.